Hello and welcome to Cut the Fat, a webinar on trans fatty acids and how India has been trying to ensure that it goes out of the food chain before the WHO deadline of 2023. We have with us today Dr. Francesco Branca, Director, Department of Nutrition for Health and Development of the World Health Organization from Geneva. We have Dr. Sudhir Gupta, Additional Deputy Director General of Ministry of Health and Family. Ms. Vandana, South Asia programs that campaign for tobacco-free kids and global health advocacy incubator. Mr. Sunil, Bakshi, Head Codex Regulations, Safety and Standards, Food at the FSSAI, and Mr. Ashim Sanyal, COO, Consumer Voice. Before we begin, I'd just like to, brief introductory remark by Mr. Arun, CEO of the FSSAI.
This is a very important problem facing the society today. Reduction of trans fat is an absolute must, and the entire world is struggling with this issue. The world has resolved, WHO has resolved that we will bring it down to 2% by the year 2023. Now you see there are three aspects to reducing trans fat consumption. One is to provide information to the public. Unless they know what they are consuming, they can't make any informed choices. The second is the regulatory aspect. And the third, of course, is to engage with all the stakeholders and to ensure that trans fat free or low trans fat products become available to people, because unless they have choices, they can't really reduce their consumption of trans fat. So as far as information is concerned, we already have rules in our country that every packet of food has to display the level of trans fat. It is transparently displayed nowadays. But regulation is the critical aspect before we make progress. On the regulatory front, right now we have a stipulation that no oils will contain more than 5% trans fat. That is the existing position. In addition to this, we have a trans fat free logo which is given to products which have very low trans fat. So this trans fat free logo is given to restaurants also, food establishments where low trans fat food is being prepared. We have this logo system which can be seen by the public, and people can go to restaurants which serve trans fat free food. One important aspect is to help school children, youngsters, to avoid having trans fat, because if they start young, then they can continue their habits later on. So good habits should develop at a very early stage. With that in mind, now we have come out with a new regulation. It is being notified very shortly, which says that high fat, salt and sugar products, which are commonly referred to as junk food, will not be sold and will not be marketed, advertised in campuses of schools and in areas within 50 meters of the school gate. So this is one regulation which is going to ensure that healthy food, nutritious food is made available in school canteens, and children start having healthy food at a very young age. The other aspect is about the levels of fat which are trans fat which are allowed right now. As I said, it is 5% at present. Now I am very happy. Yesterday we had a presentation before the Honorable Health Minister, and he has kindly given his approval to a new regulation which is saying that by the year 2022 we will have 2% trans fat only in all oils and vegetable fats. It is to be done in a phased manner. By 1st of January 2021, it will be reduced to 3% from 5% right now, and by the next year 2022 it will come down to 2%, and this is in keeping with our commitment that when India celebrates 75 years of freedom, we would like to have less than 2% trans fat. This regulation is going to be published. It is a final regulation which will come out very shortly. Apart from that, we are also coming out with a draft regulation which says that in all processed food, the amount of trans fat should not be more than 2% of the fat content in that processed food. So this is a draft stage. This also would be published shortly, and it may take some time to get finalized, may take 5 or 6 months. But for oils and vegetable fats, we are very shortly coming out with the final regulation saying that it has to be reduced from 5% to 3% and then from 3% to 2% by the year 2022. This is the regulatory aspect, but you see, regulations alone don't really win the war. Ultimately, we have to engage with all the stakeholders. So when we say information is mandatory and the regulation says that trans fat free products or low trans fat free products have to be made available, the question is how do they actually become available? There the crux of the matter lies there. So in the next phase, as soon as we have this regulation, we will go for very intense engagement with all the stakeholders. There are multinational companies which have reduced trans fat in their products worldwide, and there are Indian companies which have the potential of reducing trans fat. So, what is required is to engage with all of them, make expert advice and scientific advice available to them, make them share their own experiences with each other, and ultimately ensure that low trans fat products become available to the customer. The consumer should have a choice, and then he can choose to go for low trans fat. But if we have a regulation, if we make information available, but products do not become available in the market, then it is a wasted effort. So, that is the most critical aspect which we have to focus on now, that the regulation is in place, and we will focus on that now.
We move on to Dr. Sudhir Gupta. Dr. Gupta, the government does a lot for portion. We have Nutri-Garden, fortification, MDM, ICDS, But what about foods with salt, sugar, high TFA? What kind of intervention do you think that requires? And in a country which has a lot of NCT burden, what role does the safe food system play?
Actually, in the NCDs, which is about half to two-thirds of the all morbidity and mortality, basically the food is one of the major factor. So in the dietary factors, there are several things, and the fruit and vegetable is a very important aspect. And the fats aspect, and then the micronutrients and other things. So government has a lot. The TFA, hundreds of actions done. I would like to apply about there is a National Program for Diabetes and Stroke, started in 2000, upscaled in 2000 under NHM. It has various components of the awareness and early detection and then treatment and follow-up and even further on to palliative care. So under that, we have a setup. There's a basic healthcare delivery setup which is happening through the state and center. Our program supplements. So under that program, already there are NCD clinics, and up to the lower level, up to ASHA. There are ASHA workers, accredited social health activists, which is working in village. So they even carry out the nutrition day. There is a village health sanitation and a nutrition day, VSNND. It is done every month. So nutrition counseling is done up to grassroots level. We have a nutrition counseling at other levels, PHC, CHC and district and medical college and above for the tertiary care. So it is happening. So about the dietary advice, we use the various social media, we use electronic media, we use the print media. So we often go for the TV talks, and we carry out on the specific health advice. Food is one of the major factors. If we understand that, we will win the half of the battle. So what is that? Fruit and vegetable. Whatever fruit and vegetable are available, affordable, and of the season, they should be used not only one time or two times, at least 3 times. In the West, they say 5 times, but for the India, 3 times is enough. So it means practically with the meal or between the meals, some kind of fruit, some portion of the fruits. And salt. Salt is now advisable not to be taken, minimum to be taken, less than 5 grams per day. Indians, we often take 8 to 10 grams per day. We have the habit of having salty things, achar, chutney and all that. So salt is the main strategy. So for salt, actually salt reduction has to be done. And then sugar also. Plain sugar is bad for the health. Even those who are non-diabetic, even they should have less of sugar. Sugar should not to be added. What is a plain sugar? It should be avoided, like instead of juice, you must take fruits. And then come to fat. Fat should be less, and it should be trans fatty free, because trans fatty acid, even in small amounts, is dangerous for health. Various innumerable studies are there. And now in India, we are gradually reducing from 5 to 2%, as you just heard, and then gradually to 0 also. And in our food labeling, in the biscuits and everything, the trans fatty acid percentage is given. And for that, we have a FSSAI. We have Sunil Bakshi from FSSAI, Food Safety and Regulatory Authority of India. It is a big institution, and they do the regulatory aspect and also to some extent the promotional aspect. Like in our program, we do about the food advice inbuilt, but FSSAI is purely for that purpose only. It is one program, and under that, I would like to make a mention of multinational action plan, MNAP. Under the program, all the countries, they have agreed that we will have a multinational action plan, because it cannot be done by one ministry or one person. It has to be, action has to be done by various ministries. And out of about 40 ministries are related, and about 16 are focus industry. What are the focus industry? The finance ministry, the information and broadcasting, the agriculture. I will give some example, like finance. The tax should be increased. Like we are doing for the tobacco, the taxes are increasing gradually. And all those food which high sugar, high salt and high fats, they can have more tax gradually, phase-wise. And trans fatty acid should be least. For that, regulations are coming, and as informed by the chairperson. So lot of actions are happening. So multinational action plan, other things like agriculture ministry, several actions. I would not like to quote because it will take a long time. And similarly, the information broadcasting, they can have, like for tobacco, they have a runner. Whenever there is a picture having somebody smoking, they have a warning that tobacco. And I'm sure in the time to come, we will be having similar kind of a use of the information broadcasting ministry. So these are some examples. So there are several ministries, we are implementing that. And our overall program is National Health Mission. And under that, now we are having health and wellness centers. Government is committed to have 1.5 lakh across India. And what are these centers? These are upgraded sub-centers or primary health centers. So they will be remodeled, and training will be done. The medicines will be available. The counseling will be done. Ayush and yoga will be there, and screening is also there. So that about more than 40,000 are operational. So there is a paradigm shift. Now we talk of prevention. Earlier, 2 decades back, we were talking only treatment. Koi bimar ho gaya to treat karte the. Lekin now, I think prevention is in the forefront by this one.
That's a very interesting thing. So we are eventually looking at a sort of a sin tax on various things like salt, sugar, and in the way of things. Let me move on to Ms. Vandana Shah. Ms. Shah, GHAI has worked in a number of countries, and across incomes and across developmental parameters with great success. Would you sort of give us a few best practices which we could perhaps imbibe in India?
Thank you for the question and for putting together this panel. First, I just want to thank Mr. Gupta. I think what he said was music to my ears, because, I've been working with tobacco around the world and in India over the last decade. So I think some of the same restrictions, higher taxes, labeling, warning, all of those, would add a lot to, India's food environment. I wanted to share in terms of best practices, a couple of case studies from countries where we've had success, where the Global Health Advocacy Incubator, we work around the world to support strong public health policies, especially food safety and trans fat. We've had 2 great successes, which are very relevant in the last 12 months. So the first success in Brazil. December 2019, the country approved a best practice TFA measure. So actually, Brazil is now set to implement interim 2% fat TFA limit, which will be followed by a permanent PHO ban. So, and what they're planning to support this is a really multifaceted education and advocacy campaign, which is led by nutritionists, which will really help to bolster the case for policy change, which GHAI is supporting the government in doing. So just to sort of talk about it, what they're looking at is that by July 1, 2021, the regulation will cap all trans fat at 2% of total fat and refined vegetable oils. And then by January 1, 2023, they're looking at a total ban on partially hydrogenated oils. So this is a great success story that when GHI started working on trans fat, this was one of our focus countries along with India. The other country which we just recently had a big success is Turkey, where in May 2020, the government has published regulations to set up a 2% TFA limit on food, which is intended for the final consumer and for retail. This policy, interestingly, they've only given like actually 7 months and goes into effect on January 1, 2021. And this is in line with the European Union's TFA regulation. So again, GHAI worked very closely with civil society as we're doing in India. And that really elevated TFA as a major public health concern. And they actually built a huge public demand campaign, requiring this regulation be passed immediately. So I just want to emphasize that, that around the world, countries are really looking at this and taking note. And as I said, resonating that, trans fat is a silent killer and it's in our food supply in so many ways. So we do need to enact either a total ban or 2% limit as India is planning on oils, fats, and foods at the earliest, especially as we're seeing, I just want to emphasize, increasing comorbidities with heart disease, other issues that are coming up even in the times of pandemic. So I just want to share those two examples. But, the other countries where we're actually very imminently looking at bans now are like Bangladesh, we're looking at Nigeria, we're looking at the Philippines, where we're working very closely with governments, and they're all closing in on the same percentage.
Okay, that's interesting. But, Ms. Shah, I was just wondering, you mentioned Brazil. What kind of challenges did they really face in that period? What kind of challenges did Brazil face?
So I think there was one of the challenges that, really came up was, Brazil is also looking at a front of package labeling. So that actually obviously has been delayed. There's a lot more pushback, and which is very similar to our situation in India. And I'd really like to emphasize that because India has been working on an FOPL regulation for even longer than it's been working on trans fat. But I think Brazil made a strategic decision to go ahead and issue the trans fat regulation because, it's a similar lobby, especially when it comes to the food industry. And so Brazil, actually, there was a huge controversy, but I think there was clarity that they needed to move forward with the trans fat regulation, which they did. And now the FOPL regulation is moving forward. So I'm really hoping in a very similar environment that India will move ahead with regulating trans fats, on oils, fats, and foods immediately, and then very seriously look at moving forward with FOPL in the very near future to strengthen all other food safety laws.
Wonderful. I think Dr. Branca is in, but I think he is having difficulty with the video, so we'll just have him as an audio. There was a WHO report called From Burden to Best Buys. Why was TFA selected as a best buy or something that would yield quick results with minimal pain?
2 grams per day of trans fat. WHO has identified that an increased intake of trans fat, more than 1% of energy, is associated to increased risk of coronary heart disease. In 2010, over 500,000 deaths were attributable to intake of trans fat. And at the moment in the world, we have excess intake of trans fat in a large number of people. We still had over 13 million metric tons of trans fat produced. So WHO has identified a series of actions which are cost-effective and affordable by low and middle-income countries to act on non-communicable disease risk factors, so tobacco, alcohol, unhealthy diet, and physical inactivity. With a bit more than $1 per day, one could save 100 years of disability-adjusted life years in low and middle-income countries. So the elimination of trans fat through the development of legislation to ban use in the food chain is indeed one of these best buys. It's very important that it's done in India because about 10% of coronary heart disease deaths are due to trans fat intake.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Branca. I think that makes it clear why I think trans fat was chosen as the best buy instead of a burden. Let me come to Mr. Bakshi. Mr. Bakshi, FSSAI has done some proactive work over the last few years. An example, of course, is this proposed 2% ban, foods, fats, oils, and things. What are the steps being taken to ensure compliance? these two drafts notified, how will you ensure compliance, particularly in the unregulated sectors?
Thank you, Mr. Sengupta. And in the beginning, I would say that the CEO of Food Safety and Standards of India has summarized everything what food safety authorities in the field of trans fats. As far as you see, the regulations, they are being framed, and as soon as they come into force, then the food business operators have to, comply with these regulations. Some of the regulations are in the pipeline, which will be notified shortly. Some are already there, and which is being currently followed by the food business operators. As far as the enforcement of these regulations is concerned, I would say that Food Safety and Standards Act 2006, the enforcement of this act and regulations, it's a joint responsibility of the state machinery as well as the Food Standards Authority of India.
Right.
Largely, it is being done by the states, which in each state we have a setup under the State Food Safety Commissioner, under the food safety officials, and that's enforcement is practically being done. But I will also say that food safety is everyone's business. So when we make regulations, in order to make regulation in terms of their, being implementable and these being enforced properly, the food business following these. So over the last 3-4 years, we have sort of tried to change our strategies and be very much inclusive in our work. What basically that and partnerships, all types of stakeholders, be it the state level regulatory authorities, be it businesses, be it consumers, be it the scientific community, and everything is discussed together with all these stakeholders, so that more awareness is spread among all the stakeholders, and there is a will to comply with these regulations. Mm-hmm. So in this case, I would say that Food Safety Authority has taken, several initiatives have been launched over the last couple of years. And in fact, in 2018, FSSAI launched a mass media campaign, which is Heart Attack Rewind, which is a 30-second public service announcement on harmful effects of trans fat by reducing acceptability of industrially produced trans fats, and also building public support for government action to eliminate trans fat, and also leading consumers to the FSSAI website to seek more information on what information is given about the trans fats over there. It said that we enter into negotiations or partnerships with all types of stakeholders. We had lots of discussions with the food business associations. We have set a deadline of having not more than 2%, which is to be by January 2002. But we have given a phased of an approach to reach that deadline. So be 3% to be achieved by January 1st January 2021. So keeping these regulatory approaches and then some sensitization programs, then entering into and make state authorities aware of all these issues, and also making consumers aware of. We are hopeful. We are very much of having a system, regulatory system within the country, which will give us total freedom from trans fats. As
Ashim yet? Ashim, there?
Yeah.
So,
I'm there.
Oh, great. So let me come back to the question I had right in the beginning. That how difficult is it? We just had that on regulatory issues and stuff like that. How difficult is it to work regulatory framework, TFA elimination, and actually this in the Indian
regulatory framework requires a lot of attention, and a lot of time has to be given back, and which because you're dealing with specialists both at the regulatory level and with industry, considered to be opponents for many of the regulatory reforms. They give a pushback to the consumer movement sometimes. And I think most importantly for consumer organizations to have a footprint on the regulatory setup. In fact, it's important for us to give information to regulators and to the authorities about something that is harmful, that we think about, bring in the global best practices to the table and give slight examples and basically active examples of places where such a regulation has brought something for the consumer's health. Because we are talking about, in this particular case, health, and that is for the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, as well as for FSSAI, and as well as many society organizations. Now, this is because of the reason that one, you have a theory operation that this is good for the consumer, and on the other hand, basically, you don't have that consumer footprints on your side, and you're on behalf of the consumers, in fact, whereas the industry speaks for itself as a, in fact. There is a difficulty in terms of timelines, for example, and most importantly, it is speaking the same language with a group of people that, who have diversified interests, and all we have to remember always that a regulator's job is to balance out the market conditions as interest. So be hypothetically speaking about only consumer welfare. So a balanced approach is a must as far as the regulatory framework is concerned. Now, the difficulty is basically the footprint that is left in terms of your estimation, time estimation, in terms of a regulation framework to be brought in by the regulator, and actually when it happens. And if we talk of just concentrate on trans fat itself, we are talking of the year 2010 when the draft regulation for 10% was brought in fact, and effectively it came into practice end of 2012. Similarly, 5% it was basically 2015, and effectively it came into play in terms of dates. I think 2017 again, mid of 2017. So these are the time gaps that give you a lot of hypertension in terms of the custodians of consumer welfare, as we call ourselves. In fact, in that we are basically trying to protect the consumer without the consumer knowing much about the subject matter. So it is these pain points have to be there in mind when we actually go to the regulatory table framework. And most importantly for us, in fact, it is the implementation and the enforcement stage that gives us the maximum worry, in fact, because this is something that has been noticed repeatedly in many of the regulators' framework, in fact, that this doesn't really happen as it should have had happened. And you did pose questions similar to what I'm answering, in fact, earlier on. And I think the regulator basically is, in this particular case, they're dependent on the states to implement it. So it is a lot of people sailing in a small boat together, in fact, and a lot of people trying to have a common understanding. And if I may just give an example of the 2% part of it, in fact, or 3% part of it, if you look at the timeline now, we are in August, in fact, and if it is to be implemented from 1st of January 2021, then we are short of time, because it is we have already the 6 months time FSSAI probably would give to the industry. So we're having a backlog already, in fact, in the month of August. That's a worry for us. So similar worry is for the 2022 implementation. In fact, if it takes 6 to 8 months or 1 year to actually get the draft notification through, all the files through, in fact, again, we may actually fall back upon the timeline. So when we embark upon a goal in terms of regulation and its enforcement and its implementation, all three together, in fact, is what we look at. And that really doesn't happen. So most importantly for us as a pain point is the time frame. That is basically normally we have seen the implementation part actually doesn't adhere to those time limits.
Thank you. I think I'll come back to that question to the people from FSSAI and the ministry here. But let me try Dr. Branca again. When can we expect the replaced 2020 progress report to be released? And would you like to give us a sort of a sneak peek and tell us what to expect in it?
So the replace 2020 report will be released in the month of September. As you know, WHO has established a target to eliminate industrial trans fats by the year 2023, and has identified a best practice to do this, which is to establish legislation, either through establishing mandatory limits of 2% in total fat, or by, as it's been done in the US or Canada, by banning the production of industrial trans fat. So the report will say that in 2020, this best practice has now been implemented in 14 countries, and that covers about 8% of the world population, 589 million people. But also in 32 additional countries, there are mandatory limits which are in the way towards the best practices. And in the last year, there's been a lot of progress. More than 40 countries took action. We really appreciate that India, as well as Nigeria, are publishing some new legislation to eliminate trans fat. Also, different regional bodies such as the European Union or the Gulf countries have taken action. So we do appreciate the action by India. It is definitely moving towards the establishment of one of these best practices. Of course, the challenge will be the implementation, the assessment of trans fat levels in foods in India, inspection strategies, good information to the public through the establishment of trans fat logo. But a big important thing will be to select the right replacement and to avoid the use of alternative fats which contain saturated fats, which are also a problem for cardiovascular health. So we recommend to prefer for liquid oils, oils containing high polyunsaturated fats such as canola oil, sunflower oil, or olive oils. And for solid fats, to prefer what we call the interested oils or blends containing some hard stocks and polyunsaturated fat. But we should try to reduce the use of animal fats or tropical oils that are high in saturated fat.
I'll come back to you, Dr. Branca, in a second. Let me go to Dr. Gupta now. Dr. Gupta, would you like to tell me whether this pandemic has impacted our attempt to sort of ensure that we meet this deadline?
Actually, everyone knows in the pandemic, there was a lockdown and our offices worked, but in small times and all that. Now it is almost regular. So that was one part, and we are doing actions every day. So I will not say that we are not doing or we are sporadic. And I cannot defend the whole ministries. It's a collective effort, and we have to synergize and collaborate. So with FSSAI, they are doing quite a lot, and now we have a new CEO, and we are having a relationship, a better relationship now. And I'm sure in the time to come, the things will move faster. So that's a maximum I can say.
Okay, great. Can I come to Ms. Vandana Shah now? Ms. Shah, everybody talks about Denmark, but could you cite a country that is sort of more culturally and politically similar to India, number one? And number two, some of the sort of learnings, I know I asked you this earlier as well, but some of the learnings from these similar nations, which India could perhaps learn from.
So I think Denmark gets a lot of attention because, it was first and it generated really strong evidence showing that strong TFA regulations are feasible, effective, and save lives. But I think there is now increasing momentum, across the globe, in adopting these regulations in diverse countries, many of which with similar environments to India. In fact, GHAI is working with the Global Resolve to Save Lives initiatives to supporting a variety of countries around the globe in adopting strong trans fat regulations in line with the WHO recommendations. So I think A few examples that come to mind would be like Thailand, Chile, and South Africa, and then, Brazil and Turkey, which I've already talked about. So, and I think the main point to emphasize is that, there's sort of two parallel regimes. One that's a complete ban on trans fat, under the WHO system, and the other is sort of a 2% regulation. And I think countries are able to determine what is a good fit for their country, or they can even do a hybrid of the two, or a phased approach as Brazil is doing. And so I think this is, countries can sort of tailor what is needed based on, how their food system is structured and what is sort of the current, the regulatory environment. So just to share the Thailand example, it's a neighbor with a similar sort of setup with a lot of street foods. So they actually went for a PHO ban, because what they found, say, unlike in India, is that most of the TFA was coming from a few domestic PHO producers. Thus, the major sources of TFA could easily be traced to the very top of the food supply chain. So for them, a PHO ban made sense because it enabled regulators to focus monitoring and enforcement efforts at the top of the food supply chain, which is typically less resource intensive. So, ideally, if we did not have that many TFA manufacturers in India, I mean, that could have been something to consider, because, the monitoring is much easier, which we found, even as a challenge in India, even with the current 5% regulation. And then for imports, Thailand already had a certification process in place, which it used for, extending the PHO ban to all imports, I think Thailand did not have as big a problem, and the regulation was designed as part of a preventive measure. And because the country did not want TFA to become a huge problem. Chile is closer to what we're trying to do, which is like a 2% TFA limit. They also, are a best practice because they also have mandated very strong FOPL labeling, which includes obviously TFA. The food industry actually initially pushed back. So, so it was very important because civil society, government worked closely in Chile, and, and to make sure that industry understands that, replacing TFA was possible, And in fact, one of the important things, I think I would emphasize for Mr. Gupta is that the Ministry of Health highlighted actually the healthcare costs resulting from TFA consumption. And now there was sort of very strong support for moving forward with the regulation. So as I said, there are several countries right on the anvil, along with India. So hopefully India can beat them in issuing the 2% regulations. Would be Bangladesh, Nigeria, Philippines, all with very similar, food environments that are looking at, issuing 2% regulation.
I think we will close with last quick question to Dr. Bakshi. I mean, Mr. Bakshi, Mr. Sunil Bakshi, given we have two separate drafts on TFA. And as Ashim said that, we have already sort of very close to the deadlines. Do you think that we'll be able to meet these deadlines? I mean, our own deadlines? Particularly given that, given that nutrition schemes so far have involved, addition. And in this case, we're talking about elimination. So there is a difference in the way to approach it, I suppose. So very quickly, are you confident that we'll be able to meet our deadline?
In fact, I would appreciate the concerns that have been expressed by Mr. Sanyal. But let me say that these two regulations, they have not suddenly appeared, as of now. Controlling or limiting trans fats in foods, this has been a long journey for the Food Safety Authority, as was already mentioned that initially it was the 10% level, then fixing it up at 5%, and now going further down to 2%. And in this process, as I said, that we have been actively engaged with the supply chain people, the food businesses, and in fact, they also, undertook a pledge to reformulate their products and bring down the TFAs in their products. So they are already on the job. And in any case, when this first of the regulation which limits trans fats to 3% level by 1st of January 2021. Which I think it will be notified very soon, within a month, I should say. And still 4 months are there, and people are already on the job, and they can achieve that. And then the limit of 2%, we have another year to go before that comes into place. But just one quick point is that the first question that you asked about how do we, control these things in the unorganized sector also. Everyone is aware of the food, Eat Right India movement, which is basically, built on 3 pillars of eating healthy, eating safe, and eating sustainable. And trans fats is also one of the components of that. So this Eat Right India, basically, it is a judiciously combining regulatory and capacity building measures such as Eat Right campus for people at workplaces, hospitals, and higher education institutions in schools. And there are several benchmarking and certification schemes and cluster initiatives to improve the infrastructure and hygiene compliance level at food establishments, including street food vendors. So there is a holistic approach being adopted by the food authority in improving the safety of the foods that is being made available in India, and trans fats is also one of the components in that initiative. So that's how we are going to sort of try to achieve these targets.
Wonderful. That's a very positive sort of approach that I'm hearing. I'd like to now open this up to the audience. I have a question here from Anup Sharma, who's a policy comms consultant. He says that, are voluntary commitments by the industry enough to regulate TFA components in food? I mean, shouldn't it be made legally compulsory? Perhaps Mr. Bakshi would want to answer that, or would you like Dr. Gupta to answer it? Which, I mean, either one of you. I think it's addressed to either one of you two.
If I understood it properly, the question is that, voluntary, that pledge by food business operators is not enough. But as I said, that was sort of understanding with the food business operators, but we were making them aware that we are going to come out with these regulations in which the limits will be set up. So they have to be prepared. So in that context, that pledge was taken by them, and they are fully aware that these limits will be in place by 1st January 21 and then 2% limit by 1st January 22. And they have to comply with these. So regulatory aspects, regulatory limits, they are going to be there in place, and they have to comply with these.
Okay, so that's a interesting aspect. The fact that we've had a lot of issues regarding delays and slight delays, as you said, which as Dr. Bakshi said, we are in thing. There is also this question of labeling. Now, labeling is sometimes left to the industry itself. Is that a good thing, or is there a way of sort of making sure that the labeling is correct? Do we have a system in place to ensure that if the industry is labeling it as less TFA, we can actually check it and confirm? Or should we leave it to the industry?
I'll just try to explain. In fact, the regulatory regime that we are trying to bring in to control these TFAs, they are not only restricted to setting limits. We have specific requirements for labeling of TFAs also on the product. Currently, as per the Food Safety and Standards Labeling and Packaging Regulation, if any food business operator is making a claim about TFA on the label, then they also have to declare the quantity of trans fat on the product. And that is mandatory right now also. And together with this, that if they also make a claim about trans fat claim on their product, then they have to ensure that the food product that is being claimed to be trans fat free, we have set limits for the trans fats also for that purpose, that it should not be more than 0.2 grams per 100 gram or 100 ml of the food. So labeling part is also, I should say, mandatory, and it's not left to the food business operators to decide whether they want to label it on the product or not.
There's another question which has come in which says, please share about baseline data on the presence of TFA in our edible oils. Has there been any survey done on how much oil is present in our, how much TFA is present in our oils? Dr. Gupta, would you like to respond to that one?
No, I don't have that data right now.
But has there been a survey done on the amount of TFA present in our?
No, not to my knowledge, because we have several other things, and this is a specifically related to FSSAI. So Bakshi ji may be knowing.
Okay, so and then we have one for Ashim. Ashim, is Vanaspati the only source of TFA, or are there various other sort of sources which has TFA? I understand Vanaspati is probably the largest culprit in this case, but are there any other?
Yeah, I mean, Vanaspati is the culprit and notable culprit, and this is exactly what we are trying to spread across and to the consumers, and probably consumers also understand that, and that is the reason why the Vanaspati consumption in households have reduced to almost 11% from the 63% in 2008. So that means people understand that Vanaspati is a major culprit. But then we are also telling the consumers that reuse of oil is also harmful, and it does concern TFA exceeding the limits. And so therefore, reuse of oil has been cautioned, and FSSAI has already come out with some publicity material on this, and we are also trying to educate the consumers on these two aspects. But majority of it is through Vanaspati, and that is the major culprit as far as TFA is concerned. And reuse of oil, of course, there is a scheme, RUCO, from FSSAI also, where reuse oil are taken back, but these are for commercial establishments. For household, our thing is do not reuse the oil many times. In fact, I mean, the thumb rule is not more than 3 times in any case. So I think that covers the TFA part of it, the causes.
Ms. Shah, I just want to check with you. Would you have any kind of a data set in this process or out of India? Would you know of anybody who has done some kind of surveys like this on the kind of TFA presence in the Indian food chains?
So there's much older data. So I think, Ashim's pretty well aware of him. We've been partnering with Ashim. So there's older data. There's also recently, data that was generated. I mean, I'm going to maybe recognize if Rupa Shiv Shankar is there with Resolve to Save Lives. And then Ashim, there have been smaller studies, but the official data is pretty old. So I think that's an important question. I don't know, Ashim, if you want to talk about sort of the data that you've generated and data from earlier time.
Sure, Vandana. I mean,
basic data, right? That wouldn't be very recent data.
We recently did some studies, in fact, ad hoc studies on the Vanaspati industry per se. We studied the Vanaspati TFA content of 10 major manufacturers in India, and we came out with some statistics, which was also sent to FSSAI. That was basically to find out whether there is an adherence to the 5% norm as on date, in fact. And what we found out from the studies is that people are adhering to, the large manufacturers are adhering to the 5% norm in India as far as Vanaspati is concerned. And I'm talking about approximately 73 to 74% of the market share of these 10 manufacturers. So 5% adherence and the pledge basically go hand in hand, which means major players have recognized FSSAI's seriousness on this. We also did some studies on the street food, fast food joints in Delhi NCR, and basically found out that they are also complying to the current 5% norms of FSSAI, which is again a very good news. Of course, we have not done a pure study on the Chola Bhature Walas and the railway stations and the bus stands. That might throw out completely different statistics and data. But then overall, it seems to be in control in terms of the 5%, in fact, adherence to the FSSAI norm. These are the 2 major studies that we did in the last 1 year, which probably are the latest, in fact. And older than this is you have the NIN 2007-8 studies, in fact, nothing in between.
If I could just quickly chime in. So there are two sort of states where GHAI is working with civil society on implementation. That's in Punjab and Tamil Nadu as sort of a major northern and southern state. And we found that in Tamil Nadu, there were several manufacturers that were as high as 8 to 10%. So there are, and this is only in the last 6 months. This was statutory testing done in Tamil Nadu. So there are, issues even of compliance with the 5%.
Wonderful. There's a lot of other questions coming in, but unfortunately we are sort of running out of time. But I think overall, I'm getting a very positive feel from the government and from the other panelists here that we will, despite the pandemic, will be able to sort of, achieve our deadline. That's at least what I'm hearing. Now, I mean, God forbid that we don't have something else that comes in, because pandemics seem to be the norm these days. But it's been a real pleasure talking to all of you, because we've had people here from 3 separate continents. I mean, we've had people from Europe, from Dr. Branca from Geneva, Vandana from the US, and all our people from the government here. I really appreciate you taking time out for this, because I think this was a very important thing for not just us, but for the community at large to understand why trans fats is dangerous and what steps we are all taking to cover all this. Thank you so very much for being with us. I really appreciate this. Have a great day and stay safe. Thank you. Goodbye.